When Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention emerged onto the international music scene with their 1966 debut Freak Out, few knew what to make of the record or of the band's prominent frontman. The LP's lurid cover, its satirical content and its combination of various disparate musical forms confused many, unsure whether it was simply a drug-induced joke or something far more vital. Yet on the inside of this double album was a list of influences. 179 names, a few familiar but the majority obscure, that provided a key to understanding the musical vision of the band's mastermind, Frank Zappa. And the music that Zappa composed and organized out of these influences was difficult and silly, highbrow and lowbrow all at once. As the band grew in number and their music began to draw a wide base of loyal and ardent supporters, they emerged as a totally unique outfit in the rock world. And Zappa himself, a musical visionary, an artist whose work could not be compared to any of his contemporaries. That complexity was due in part to the influence of some of the more obscure names cited within the Freak Out list. Whereas many of the figures looking to incorporate a new, artistic dimension into popular music were becoming au fait with the avant-garde by the end of the decade, Zappa entered the rock world already fully immersed in music from the margins. Since a teenager, he had been particularly drawn to the more difficult works of the iconic classical composers from the first half of the 20th century. These composers were revolutionaries, rewriting the rules and dramatically altering the sonic possibilities of a classical music that had been dominant for the past 200 years, and both their work and their attitude was hugely influential on the young Zappa. Despite the initial suspicion with which his music was greeted, Schoenberg's innovations created an entire musical system, serialism, and his practices were echoed throughout the 20th century. Zappa too studied Schoenberg's work, and the Austrian composer was one of the key names from classical music on Freak Out's eclectic list. And just as Zappa was fascinated by the very singular path that Schoenberg had taken, he was also intrigued by the equally unique work of the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky. Named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century, Stravinsky's response to Wagner's compositional challenge found a far larger audience than Schoenberg's, though it was no less daring or inspired.
I think it'd be fair to say in part one of Lumpy Gravy, this is exactly what happens, in that one gets a number of compositions which are cut up and pasted in with other musical items, as well as sound effects, extracts of conversation, and so on and so forth.
Zappa's interest in the composers of the 20th century led him to Schoenberg's key pupil, Webern, the electronic works and tape manipulations of Karlheinz Stockhausen and Pierre Schaeffer, and the pioneer of chance music, John Cage. Yet his greatest inspiration in this realm remained the first classical composer whose work he had discovered, the Frenchman Edgar Varèse. Another musical visionary, across a relatively small number of works composed both in France and in America, he redefined the role of timbre and rhythm in classical music. His magnum opus, Ionization, composed in the late 1920s, was a work written entirely for percussion, and towards the end of his life he embraced electronic music. On Zappa and the Mothers' debut, Freak Out, not only is Varèse's name amongst the list of influences, but his declaration that the present-day composer refuses to die is included by Zappa as a kind of war cry, a statement of intent that would also appear on several other Mothers releases throughout the 60s.
This must have been an astonishing experience for Zappa in his teens, discovering this music. And certainly it's the percussive aspects of Varèse's work that stick out most obviously in Zappa's own music.
And as with the entire culture of rock and roll, the bedrock of Zappa's approach to popular music was rhythm and blues. Just as the freak-out list of influences mentioned obscure composers unknown to many of its audience, it also included both popular and less familiar names from the world of R&B, whose work was inspirational for the young Zappa. And although by the time he was making his first steps into the popular music industry, many of these artists were being celebrated by the bands of the British invasion, back in the 1950s, even those figures who went on to the greatest success were a marginalized element of American popular culture.
Work with me, Annie. Work with me, Annie. Ooh-wee. Work with me, Annie. Work with me, Annie. Work with me, Annie. Let's get it while the getting is good.
While Zappa took much from the R&B tradition, he was also fondly drawn to one particular strand of it, vocal group harmony rhythm and blues, which would popularly be remembered as doo-wop. Unlike the more rough and ready sounds of the R&B music of Howlin' Wolf and Johnny Guitar Watson, the romantic, smooth harmonies of doo-wop lent it a huge commercial appeal. Even though it was a sound born from the streets, it would become one of the dominant musical genres of the late 50s, and bands such as the Moonglows, the Coasters, the Penguins and the Cadillacs found themselves thrown into the spotlight with worldwide hits. And it was this very particular sound that Zappa would often turn to, adding yet another string to his musical bow. Although from Freak Out onwards, doo-wop was a genre that Zappa would often throw into the mix. With 1968's Cruising with Reuben and the Jets, he even produced an entire album's worth of vocal harmony material. To some, his experiments with doo-wop have been seen as pure satire, but this was in fact a musical form for which he had a very real affection.
What's the ugliest part of your body? What's the ugliest part of your body? Some say your nose, some say your toes. I think it's your mind, your mind. I think it's your mind.
And after the original Mothers had split, Zappa also showed that he had a certain love for and could find humor in a form of music to which he had never been previously linked, jazz. The distinctive traits of this highly respected and often musically elitist genre began to infiltrate his work at the close of the 1960s, a period in which jazz musicians themselves were beginning to branch out and explore new avenues. After years of being seen as incompatible idioms, certain artists from both sides of the divide began to blur the line between jazz and rock, and these experiments forced the hand of the more established players. Just as few would have expected the jazz-influenced direction that Zappa was about to make, even fewer would have predicted that Miles Davis, the godfather of cool jazz, would begin to embrace electric instrumentation and become a figurehead for the new fusion music that was to come. But his watershed 1969 album, In a Silent Way, made him a standard-bearer for further experimentation. With 1969's Hot Rats, however, the sounds of jazz were more apparent. Emerging at the very genesis of jazz rock, when Miles Davis himself had yet to release the seminal Bitches Brew, Zappa therefore stood not as a follower of fashion, but as one of the new fusion pioneers. And as the other key players of the movement continued forging new sounds and exploring the possibilities and the limitations of the musical crossover, after the Grand Wazoo, Zappa abandoned his more overt jazz rock tendencies. Looking back on Zappa's remarkable career, he now stands as a totally unique artist in the history of popular music. An inimitable oddity, his democratic ear and his insistence on incorporating a huge variety of musical styles into his output not only leads his many fans back to those artists who influenced him, but can also shed new light on how Zappa's music, the work of a formidable present-day composer, has refused to die.